Hello! Welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here with George Ortega. And for this episode, we're going to be talking about choice in relation to video games, and we can tie this in with the free will belief that people have, and explain how not while we try to explain how none of our decisions that we make in our daily lives are freely willed decisions. And we can go into that some. But for this example, we can use video games. I mean, in any video game would work, and I have a few examples that I could use. But it's about the causality of why do we choose to play the game in one way or another. There's some reason for it, some preference or some other reason you play this game because this helps you win when you play it a certain way. So yeah, I think this will be something that a lot of people will be able to relate to. Um, George, have you ever played any computer games, any video games in your time?
Well, I mean, like the first game that was out, I mean, I think it was called Pong. This was like many moons ago. And so, like, yeah, a friend of mine and I used to play it at a bar, and we actually mastered this thing. We got on it so we could like play as long, like the more points you scored, the longer we could play. So we kind of like played until we wanted to and all. But I really haven't, and I played a little what Kong, I think. I don't know, a few of them, but not any of the like many more complicated recent ones.
Yeah, well, we could start out by talking about some of the older games and how that works, because I know about Pong. That's kind of interesting. That's basically, isn't there like a bouncing ball and you have to move this bar that it bounces off of?
Exactly, it's kind of like a ping pong, video ping pong, right?
Yeah, so that's a classic game that a lot of older people will know of, but might not necessarily know the more modern stuff. And then another classic example is Pac-Man. I'm sure you
Right.
Pac-Man, you're this little yellow guy. All you are is a circle with a mouth that opens and closes, and you have to avoid the ghosts that are chasing you.
Yeah, no, I played that a few times. I played that about a month ago or so at an amusement park. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that's another classic one. And then here's one that I know a lot of people have played is Tetris.
Yes, that's with the things keep coming down, I guess, and you have to like, yeah, okay.
It's interesting. I even used to do pixel art based on Tetris, because they're all square blocks, and I would do pixel art, and I'd make patterns. They have the S blocks, the L blocks, all those kinds of blocks. And what was interesting about Tetris is, I played that a long time ago on the original Game Boy. The big fat old gray thing that took like four AA batteries.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and what was interesting about that is, you don't know what blocks you're gonna get. So what you have in that particular game of Tetris is you have pseudo randomness, because we talk about how there's no such thing as true randomness as an acausality, but there's an unpredictability. You don't know what your blocks are going to be before you start playing. And then whatever blocks the game gives you, you have to figure out how to make rows across the screen so that the stack goes down, because if it fills up, you lose.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and so that's a fine example. So here's the deal: almost every video game, not to mention every board game or sport, has some goal. There's an objective. You do this, you win. You do something else, you lose. And so you may know a lot of people get very competitive about games, don't they?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, which raises the question. I wonder if a lot of that competition has to do with free will belief. If people would have like less, if there would be less competition if people didn't believe in it. But absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's the deal is I think that the free will belief is heavily related to people's competition in all their games. And here's what's interesting about it is, see, I have this friend who he was a piano student of my mom's, and so he would come over to our house sometimes, or I go over to his house, and we would play all kinds of games. You know, we'd play this NES game called Bubble Bobble, where you're basically these dragons that shoot bubbles. Or we'd play Super Smash Brothers, which has got to be the most competitive, but also the cutest fighting game ever.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and here's what's interesting: is Ben Delheim was very competitive, and he would always compare things. We'd be even playing a cooperative game, but then he'd be bragging that he got the higher score, and or something like that. And then I would get a higher score, and so I would brag about it. And he says it's not a competition, and or something, and then when he would have a higher score than me, he would brag about it. And I said, I thought you said it wasn't a competition. He said, it's not as long as I'm losing. But yeah, basically, there's a lot of competition in all these games, especially when it comes to, the massive multiplayer online RPGs. And you will find people who will get really, really mad at people who beat them a lot. And so, or if somebody cheats or is believed to be cheating, people will blame them and they'll get mad at them. So what's interesting is now I'm not one of the most competitive people, but even less so since I've seen free will as an illusion. But I do think that to a certain extent, um, in order to be competitive, in order to get your sense of self worth, your satisfaction of being better at a game than others, you have to believe in free will. You know what I'm saying?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because, like, for example, like, um, let's say, all right, I don't believe in free will, right? And I'm playing because I'm playing some kind of a game with someone, and see, it's like the lottery. For example, like, people play the lottery, right? And they know it's not really up to them at all whether they win or lose. They know it's about luck, right? But somehow we're actually conditioned, I think, to really want to win and to enjoy winning. So I think there might be a separation between, it may be that there's a stronger correlation between people who believe in free will and those who, let's say, get emotional about it, like, will get angry or who really need to win and stuff. But I think there's also kind of like a just an inherent pleasure in playing the game and in, like, being, for example, fated to play it well. Like, if I'm playing, for example, tennis with someone, and all the I'm hitting the ball well or something, there's a pleasure in that, even though, like, I might say to myself, I wonder why that's happening, and certainly it's not up to me fundamentally. So you hear what I'm saying, or?
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, there's certainly a satisfaction in doing well at a game and getting better at it. And obviously, we're motivated to win because otherwise, why do people try? You know what I mean? We like it, and we get some pleasure out of it. But I think that there is a connection, at least in some cases, where people that when they take things so seriously, and like, let's say that somebody loses at a game, and then they start feeling like a failure and like they're stupid and they're wondering why aren't I able to do this. I think that can happen sometimes.
Well, yeah, that's, I think I would agree with you. I think there probably is a pretty strong correlation between people's emotional reaction to games and their belief in free will. Like, the more of a belief in free will one has, um, the more one might become, let's say, arrogant, like your friend, like you're bragging, and the more one might, feel really, really disappointed and really feel bad to the extent they lost. Absolutely. Because they're blaming themselves if they lost.
Yeah, and I think that's what tends to happen because see, there's the positive aspect of competition, but there's also the negative aspect. And I think that as we shift away from free will belief, we can still retain much of the positive while reducing the negative. And here's how I think that works. Because you still get the satisfaction out of winning, out of doing well at a game, you know. Um, but at the same time, then when you fail, you just realize, well, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. If I had a free will, if I was really in control, I would always know the right thing to do. I would be able to always put those Tetris blocks in the right spot. But I think what happens is as you become experienced with games, you start realizing that there's limits to your reflexes. There's limits of your ability to predict things. And that started to happen to me long before I lost belief in free will. I would start realizing, wait a minute, how come in Dance Dance Revolution I can't always step on the arrows at the right time and get a perfect score?
Well, exactly. And video games are an excellent way to demonstrate to oneself that we don't have a free will. Because you're right. If we had a free will, we'd be quicker, we'd be more accurate, we'd be better players. Because why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we will ourselves to be that way?
Yeah, and what's particularly interesting about this, George, is that this applies even in single player games because obviously when you're playing games with other people, you can't predict what's going on in their minds and the decisions that they're making. But when you're just playing a single player game, when you're just playing against, the computer opponents that really are predictable, but still you're not always able to win. Or Dance Dance Revolution is a fine example because it's always the same. Every time you play the song, you're supposed to hit those arrows at the right time. But we find that we still can't be perfect and get the perfect score all the time. And then it leads us to think, well, why can't we?
I know. And then, like again, like there's so many other examples of that in our life. I remember like I tried to learn how to speed read when I was like I think in high school or a few years after. And you can speed up your reading maybe a bit, right? But there's a limit there with any kind of skill, even like being happy, just like these thoughts, just they'll come into our minds, just any kind of thought. So no, absolutely. But video games definitely are a way to just understand that if we had a free will, we would just simply decide to play the game better. This decide to be quicker, to be to pay more attention, to do whatever skill is required. And obviously, that's not up to us. Now we can improve, right? But even like I think there's pretty there's a relationship, a correlation between, for example, how much we play the game and how quickly we'll improve and all. So, but that's not really up to us. That's just, that's like this learning curve.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thing. The reason that we can get better at video games in particular is because, for the most part, they do stay the same to a large extent. Um, because let's say that there's a level and there's a certain spot that something kills you in a certain spot. And it could be all kinds of things like in Super Mario Brothers, like there'll be those fiery ball things that spin around and will kill you. But the reason that you avoid them in the future is because you remember where they are, you remember at which point you have to jump over it in order to get past it. And so through constant practice of being in the a similar situation, and here's the key thing, you're never in the same situation twice because people say, well, I'm in the exact playing the exact same level, I'm in the exact same situation, but not exactly because their memory has changed. Because they now remember what killed them in that game the last time, that's how they're able to avoid it. So this is the process of trial and error and how we learn and get better at avoiding things that cause us to lose in games.
Right. And, so this is another example. Like a lot of people will say, they really haven't thought it out completely. They'll say, well, like if I give up my sense of free will, or if we don't have free will, how can I become better? How can I like advance? How can I improve and all? And so these video games just show that exactly. Like with a video game as well as with any kind of a skill that you might want to like get better at. You simply practice more. I mean, it's like you know, you, it's this idea that what we do has consequences. Regardless of whether we have a free will or not. I mean, like you know. Even because we don't have a free will, we can like predict that, on average, for example, the longer we'll play a game, the better we get at it and the faster. So this not only shows us that that we don't have a free will, but it shows people who like tend to kind of like have this mistaken fatalist view that no, not having a free will doesn't mean that we can't improve in various ways, in our life.
Yeah, there's all kinds of skills that we can get better at, whether that's video games or happiness or playing a musical instrument or whatever. There's all sorts of ways in which we get better as we learn more and we learn to avoid certain mistakes. And in fact, this is actually it's more like we have no choice but to get better because we want to get better. And therefore, when we want to get better, we keep practicing and we get better because we're learning and how to do it.
That's a great point, Chandler, because like somebody might be playing a video game, right? And let's say they want to prove to you that like they have a free will, so they're going to play this game for several hours, and they're going to like not get better. They're going to decide to not get better. I think if they're sincere with themselves, if they're actually are playing rather than just like making mistakes on purpose, then I don't think you're right. I think there's no way they cannot get better.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because this is something I've been thinking about is I've been thinking that the idea of free will it assumes that you would intentionally do the opposite of what you want to do. It's bizarre because the idea that you're free to do other than what you desire to do at that time.
Right. So now, all right. So now a free will believer will say, well, I may not be free to do other than what I want to do, but I'm free to do what I want to do. So would you respond to that?
Well, for one thing, my first thought is, well, where's the freedom in that? Because it's not an otherwise situation. It's
It,
basically we don't choose our desires, we don't choose what we want in the first place. And for the most part, this isn't really a problem. It's only a problem when we have a certain desire that we wish we didn't have that desire.
oh yeah, like overeating, these different kind of like, things that we do too much of sometimes where we would prefer to do less. Absolutely.
Yeah,
And so,
absolutely. So that's the thing is there are those times when we want something but we wish we didn't want it. But what's interesting about this is I think that video games are basically they tend to not have those situations as much because in our daily lives we have those kind of things like, well, I wish wasn't hungry, because I don't have enough money to buy enough food for how hungry I am. That's a problem if you're poor, you know what I mean?
right, right.
So I'm like, I wish I didn't need to go to the bathroom right now. That kind of example. But when we're talking about a video game, here's what's interesting about it is that if somebody doesn't want to play the game, then they don't really have to. These video games are something that you do because you feel like it at the time, you know? So they're not mixed in with other things. Because, in daily life, we have the conflict of desires, like we don't necessarily feel like going into work every day, but we do it because we need the money, and we need the money because we need to pay our bills and buy food. So there's all these conflicts of desires in the real world, as it's called. There's things that we all do that we would rather not be doing sometimes. But when it comes to games, it's like whoever complains about playing a game, because if you really don't like the game, you quit playing it. There's never a conflict. There's never a problem there.
Right, with a game, as with any other kind of like this decision, if we have two different options, like going to work or not or whatever, wanting to go to work, wanting to play the game, the thing is that either one of those is not up to us. In other words, like if we're determined to want to play the game, then that's not up to us. If we're determined to not want to play the game, that's not up to us either. So that's the thing. So like there's absolutely no decision we could ever make that really would be up to us.
Yeah, because it all goes back to either nature or nurture in some sort of a way. Because either, like, for one thing, we tend to just be better at certain types of games than others. So, some people are better at, quick reflexive action type games where you're dodging enemy attacks, and or sports, for example, is a fine example of that. They're better at quick decision making, knowing what to do, like in Tetris, those blocks, you don't know what's going to happen, but you can quickly just respond. Whereas other people are better at strategy games where you're planning ahead and planning your moves in advance. So we're either better at one type of game than another, and we will naturally want to play the types of games that we're better at.
Yeah, I think a lot of sports figures, famous sports figures recognize that they kind of like they'll play a sport in junior high school and high school, and they'll notice they're like a lot better than their friends, then they'll play in college. And I think they get it. They get that, the reason I'm better, it's simply like a matter of luck, because they really can't, it's not like they decided to be better than others. And some of them may have, wanted to be better, so they practice more, but ultimately they also recognize there's this element of like, like you're saying, some people have a gift for quickness, some people have a gift for strategy, and these gifts are simply not anything that's in any way really up to us.
Yeah, and here's another way of thinking about it. Why wouldn't we just be good at everything if we genuinely had a choice in the matter?
Exactly, exactly. So we were talking before about some of these video games. Actually, they're advertised in the sense of like, well, you get to decide, what world you create and all that stuff. And all right, fine, colloquially, in a matter of speaking, yes. But, I think the important point here is that, well, fine, you get to decide, but you don't get to decide of a free will. It's ultimately like the Big Bang or whatever is in control of everything, is actually making that decision for you.
Exactly. And see, here's what's interesting about it. Like they call these sandbox type games, and like Minecraft would fall into this category, as would Terraria. And the reason that I find these games particularly interesting is that they don't have the general flow of a traditional game. They're not like Super Mario Brothers, where all there is to do is run to the right and reach the end of the level. you know.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's more like you get to build your houses, you get to dig with your pickaxe, chop down the trees, and you can fight the monsters that these games have too if you want. But it's not so much in a way, that, like, some people would say, well, this game isn't predetermined, even though everything is predetermined. That's what's ironic about it.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it would probably be possible to develop a game that while the person is playing, the person is led to the understanding that they don't have a free will. Like for example, they make a certain decision in terms of like, one action versus the other, and the game stops, and like the game asks them, so why did you make this decision? And the person might, let's say it's a multiple choice answer, like, well, because I played before and last time I played, I made the other decision and it didn't go well. So like, just like mixing the action of the game with these kinds of questions that lead people to understand that, that there are reasons why they make these decisions. These reasons ultimately are, if you follow them back, are, lead to things that are not in their control.
Yeah, if somebody could figure out how to design that game, that would be a million seller, I think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and here's what's interesting about it is what we're basically saying, George, is yes, you can still play all the video games that you like to play, and you feel free because you're doing what you want. You have practical freedom. In this case, we would call this video game freedom, because you can do what you want, and the worst possible consequence is that you lose the game, but it's not a serious matter. You know what I mean? That's what I like about video games is that you can die hundreds of times, but you never really die. You just get to start over.
That's interesting. I absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think this helps us separate things because when it comes to everyday situations, we're often faced with, you know, um, conflicts about morality. Like, well, what's the moral thing? What's the right thing to do? Or we're concerned about legal consequences if we do something illegal. And so, while, for example, driving a car is a scary thing. If someone drives a car, because there's always the risk of getting in a car wreck and people dying and all that sort of thing. But it's a lot different if you're playing like the game Driver on PlayStation. I played that game and it's like sure you get to run around drive around in a car and you can crash and die in the game, but there's no real consequence. So what is unique about video games is that they allow you freedom from any consequences that you'll regret, because it's not nobody like 20 years later is going to be regretting losing at a video game.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Absolutely. So we started this, conversation with like talking about like some people who like when they win at a video game or something, they'll become they'll start bragging, and when they lose, they'll feel upset. What's interesting, Chandler, is that like Buddhism, like when it, as it originally developed, I don't think the Buddha believed in free will. I think like after it's just like for example like in Judaism there were three sects. The Pharisees believed that we had only free will in moral decisions. The rest of it, our life was fated. The Sadducees didn't we believe that we had completely free will, and the Essenes believed that we didn't have any free will at all. So just in that same way, I think Buddha understood that we don't have a free will. And so, one of the kind of like guiding principles in Buddhism is like to kind of, and this is I think reflected in other religions, to kind of like to see victory and defeat as the same. They're kind of both illusions, like they don't mean what we take them to mean. So if we win at something, fine. If we lose at something, fine. That's the thing. So we develop this equanimity, and this is one of the benefits of overcoming this free will belief. We don't feel like a ping pong ball, just like, just being, bounced around between winning and losing and getting what we want and not getting what we want. You know what I mean?
Well, here's what's interesting about it, George, is that in a certain sense, we kind of are ping pong balls because we have about as much control over the ultimate outcome of an event as does the ping pong ball. But
Well,
imagine this, the ping pong ball blaming itself and feeling like a failure.
that's it. That's it exactly. Absolutely. So you're right. Even if we get to the point where fine, we understand we don't have a free will, we're not going to get like overly, arrogant or something when we win. We're not going to get really upset when we lose. But even that is not up to us. If we maintain our equilibrium, if we maintain this sense of this balance, that's not up to us either. Absolutely.
Yeah. But I think what will happen the more that this topic is talked about, how and why free will is an illusion, I think that people will start that they will gradually lose that blame and that feeling of regret over certain mistakes because they'll real once they realize, whoa, it wasn't really up to me. And so why was I punishing myself? Why was I blaming myself and feeling so bad about being imperfect?
Chandler, that's a great point. We're at the 30-minute mark. How about if we end this podcast and begin a new one about like predicting what the world is going to be like in terms of blame when everybody gets and nobody has a free will?
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan, George.
Cool.
Okay, you've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs and George Ortega, and we were talking about free will belief and its connection with video games and other types of competition, and we had a little bit of Buddhism and Judaism mixed in there too, so that was fun. So we're gonna do another one after this. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.